March 3, 1943. Bismarck Sea, 200 miles northeast of Lae, New Guinea. Commander Shigeru Sugawara stood on the bridge of the transport Shinai Maru, watching the horizon with growing unease. The convoy had survived 2 days of American air attacks from high altitude. Most bombs had missed. His ship still moved at 12 knots toward Lae, carrying 600 soldiers desperately needed to reinforce the garrison. Then the lookout's voice cracked through the morning air, sharp with terror. Aircraft approaching, low altitude, bearing 040. Sugawara raised his binoculars. What he saw made no sense. Twin-engine bombers, American B-25s, screaming toward the convoy at wavetop height. Not the usual formations at 20,000 feet where bombs took 30 seconds to fall, giving captains time to maneuver. These aircraft were so low their propellers nearly touched the waves. Speed over 250 miles per hour, distance closing impossibly fast. He had perhaps 40 seconds before they arrived, 40 seconds to understand what was happening, 40 seconds to give orders that might save his ship, 40 seconds before everything he knew about naval warfare became obsolete. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The nose of the lead bomber erupted in fire. 8 heavy machine guns hammered simultaneously. Sugawara watched his forward gun crew disintegrate, bodies torn apart before they could train their weapons on the attackers. Another burst swept the bridge. Glass shattered. The officer beside him collapsed, blood spreading across white uniform fabric. Then came the moment that would haunt survivors for decades. The bomber released something dark against the blue water, not falling from altitude but skipping like a stone thrown by a child across a pond. The 500-pound bomb bounced once, twice, then slammed into Shinai Maru's hull below the waterline with a sound like the world splitting open. The explosion, magnified by water pressure, tore a hole 20 feet across. Seawater poured into the engine room with the force of a tidal wave. The ship shuddered violently and began listing immediately. Sugawara had trained for every combat scenario: high-altitude bombing, torpedo attacks from submarines, surface engagement with enemy warships. Bombers attacking at mast height with overwhelming firepower, delivering ordnance at point-blank range where evasion was impossible. In 40 seconds, his ship had been transformed from functional transport to sinking coffin. 3,000 Japanese sailors and soldiers would die in the Bismarck Sea over the next hours as American strafer bombers systematically destroyed every transport and 4 destroyers. The survivors would carry a single lesson burned into memory. When you saw B-25s approaching at wavetop height, you had 40 seconds to live. Maybe less. This was not how naval warfare was supposed to work. For centuries, ships had been relatively safe from aircraft. Early bombing attempts in World War I had been largely ineffective. Bombers flying at altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire dropped ordnance that rarely hit moving targets. The mathematics were brutal. A bomb released from 20,000 feet fell for approximately 30 seconds. Ship captains watching bombs drop had ample time to order course changes. Turn the rudder 10 degrees, increase speed by 2 knots, and bombs that would have struck amidships landed harmlessly 100 yards off the port bow. Statistical analysis from 1941 and 1942 confirmed what naval commanders already knew. Conventional high-altitude bombing against ships achieved hit rates below 1%. American B-17 flying fortresses had dropped thousands of bombs on Japanese convoys throughout 1942. The vast majority missed completely. Ships steamed away unscathed while bombers returned to base, having expended massive quantities of ordnance with minimal results. Japanese naval doctrine reflected this reality. Convoys moving through contested waters faced some risk from air attack, but acceptable risk compared to the certainty of supply shortages if shipping stopped entirely. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding the escort force for the Lae convoy, had studied American bombing attempts carefully. His analysis concluded that losses from high-altitude attacks would be minimal, perhaps 1 transport damaged, possibly a destroyer if luck favored the enemy. Acceptable casualties to deliver 6,900 troops and their equipment to New Guinea. His calculations were based on established patterns of aerial combat. What Kimura did not know, what no Japanese commander understood in early March 1943, was that American tactics had undergone revolutionary transformation. The old rules no longer applied. The innovation that would kill thousands of Japanese sailors had emerged from frustration and desperation in Brisbane, Australia, during the darkest days of 1942. When General Douglas MacArthur escaped the Philippines in March 1942, he found American air power in the Southwest Pacific reduced to remnants. Most aircraft had been destroyed on the ground at Clark Field on December 8, 1941. The few bombers that escaped were ineffective against Japanese shipping. General George Kenney, arriving in July 1942 as MacArthur's new air commander, inherited a force that could not accomplish its primary mission: stop Japanese convoys from reinforcing their garrisons. Kenney was 53 years old, a World War I fighter pilot who had learned his trade in the skies over France. He understood that tactics failing to produce results must be discarded, regardless of how theoretically sound they appeared. High-altitude bombing against ships was not working, therefore different methods must be found. The British Royal Air Force had experimented with skip bombing in 1941 and 1942. The concept was elegantly simple. Approach at extremely low altitude, 200 feet or less. Release bombs with delayed action fuses at very close range, approximately 100 yards. The bombs would skip across the water surface like stones, strike the ship's hull at or below the waterline, then sink several feet before detonating. Water pressure would magnify the explosion's force, tearing massive holes that conventional bombs dropped from altitude could never achieve. British trials had shown promise, but also revealed a fatal flaw. Approaching at wave-top height exposed bombers to devastating defensive fire. Japanese destroyers and transports bristled with anti-aircraft weapons. Machine guns, 20mm cannons, larger caliber automatic weapons, all designed to shred low-flying aircraft. Ships had 30 to 40 seconds from first sighting to bomb release. More than enough time for trained gun crews to track incoming bombers and fill the sky with explosive shells. British commanders concluded skip bombing was theoretically effective but practically suicidal. Losses would be unacceptable. The technique was abandoned. Into this problem stepped a man who would change naval warfare forever, though history would barely remember his name. Paul Irvin Gunn was 43 years old in 1942, a former Navy enlisted pilot who had been told repeatedly throughout his life that certain things were impossible. He specialized in proving experts wrong. Born in Quitman, Arkansas, on October 18, 1899, Gunn had quit school after 6th grade, with dreams of flight. At 17, he joined the Navy, hoping to become a pilot, but lack of formal education barred him from officer training. He became an aviation machinist's mate instead, and used his savings to buy a surplus seaplane and teach himself to fly. When the Navy began training enlisted pilots in 1923, Gunn re-enlisted immediately and earned his wings in 1925. For 14 years, he flew fighters, served as a flight instructor, and developed a reputation as a pilot who could coax miracles from recalcitrant aircraft. By December 1939, after 21 years of service, Gunn retired as a chief petty officer. He moved his family to Manila, where he helped establish Philippine Airlines. When war came, his wife Clara and their 4 children were trapped and would spend the next 3 years in Santo Tomas internment camp. Gunn barely escaped aboard a B-17, one of only 14 heavy bombers to flee the Philippines. His family's imprisonment gave him motivation that burned with white-hot intensity. General Kenney met Gunn in August 1942 during an inspection tour of Australian bases. Their conversation lasted 3 hours and ranged across every aspect of air warfare. Gunn explained why conventional bombing failed against ships. The 30-second fall time from altitude gave captains too much opportunity to maneuver. Skip bombing could work if the fundamental problem could be solved. How to suppress defensive fire during the final 40 seconds of approach when bombers were most vulnerable. Gun's solution was elegantly brutal. Transform the bomber into a gunship that could destroy the ship's defenders before they could destroy the bomber. Install multiple heavy machine guns in the bomber's nose. Not 1 or 2 weapons, but 8 or more 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each firing 800 rounds per minute. Combined firepower would throw over 200 pounds of lead per minute directly at the target ship. Anyone standing on deck would be torn apart. Gun crews attempting to aim anti-aircraft weapons would die at their posts. Officers on the bridge would be killed before they could give evasive orders. The ship would be blinded, paralyzed, and helpless in the final seconds before bomb release. Every engineering expert gun consulted declared this concept impossible. The additional weight would shift the aircraft's center of gravity dangerously forward. Recoil from simultaneous firing would slow the aircraft and potentially damage the airframe. Gun blast might destroy propellers or tear fuselage skin. Wright Field engineers in Ohio, the Air Force's technical authority, sent telegrams insisting modified aircraft should be grounded immediately as structurally unsound. Gunn ignored them all. With Kenny's backing, he began converting bombers at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane. The first conversions used Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers. Gunn removed the transparent bombardier nose and replaced it with solid metal housing 450 caliber machine guns. 2 additional guns mounted in blisters on each fuselage side brought total forward-firing armament to 8 weapons. Test flights revealed the predicted problems: nose-heavy handling during takeoff and landing, vibration from gun blast that loosened rivets. But the aircraft flew, and when all guns fired simultaneously, the effect was devastating. Gunn extended blast tubes beyond propellers and installed reinforced plates on the fuselage to handle stress. When Wright Field sent another telegram demanding cessation of modifications, Gunn's response became legendary. Center of gravity concerns put in storage for the duration. We have a war to fight. By September 1942, Gunn's modified A-20s were ready for combat testing. Flying at altitudes where propellers nearly touched waves, Strafer A-20s roared toward Japanese positions with nose guns blazing. The effect on enemy forces was catastrophic. Men manning anti-aircraft guns found themselves under fire from aircraft simultaneously strafing and bombing. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. One mission on September 12, 1942, proved the concept spectacularly. 16 modified A-20s attacked Boona Airfield at dawn, approaching at treetop height. They swept across parked aircraft and defensive positions with nose guns hammering, destroyed dozens of Japanese aircraft, killed scores of personnel, and ignited fuel and ammunition dumps. Survivors reported it was the war's most terrifying experience. The success convinced Kenny to scale up to larger aircraft. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber offered exactly what Kenny needed. Combat radius exceeding 600 miles meant B-25s could reach targets A-20s couldn't. The bomb bay carried 4,000 pounds of ordnance. Twin Wright R-2660 Cyclone engines provided enough power for high speed at wavetop altitude. Most importantly, the nose section offered ample space for multiple machine guns without compromising airframe integrity. Kenny authorized Gunn to convert an entire squadron into what he called commerce destroyers. By early February 1943, 12 B-25 strafers were complete and assigned to the 91st Bomb Squadron under Major Ed Larner. Each aircraft mounted 850 caliber machine guns in the nose, plus the top turret could rotate forward for additional firepower. Total throw weight approached 450 pounds of lead per minute. When all guns fired simultaneously, nothing human could survive on a ship's deck. The timing was perfect. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, indicating a major convoy would depart Rabaul in early March, carrying approximately 6,900 reinforcements to Leh. This would be the largest Japanese convoy since Coral Sea, and the perfect test for Kenny's revolutionary tactics. What Japanese commanders did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that the rules of naval warfare had fundamentally changed. High-altitude bombing that gave ships 30 seconds to evade had been replaced by wavetop attacks that allowed 40 seconds from first sighting to obliteration. Those 40 seconds would prove the difference between confident expectation of safe passage and complete annihilation. The Japanese convoy departed Rabaul on the evening of February 28, 1943. It consisted of 8 transport ships carrying troops and supplies, escorted by 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. Approximately 100 Japanese Zero fighters provided air cover. The destination was Leh, about 500 miles across the Bismarck Sea. Kimura had studied American air capabilities carefully. He expected attacks from high-altitude bombers, B-17s flying at 20,000 feet. His analysis indicated acceptable risk. Some bombs might hit, perhaps one transport damaged, but the convoy would reach Leh largely intact. His calculations were based on established combat patterns. Every previous American bombing attempt against Japanese convoys had followed predictable patterns. Bombers at high altitude, bombs falling for 30 seconds, ship captains maneuvering to avoid impact. The mathematics favored the defenders. What Kimura did not know was that American tactics had been completely rewritten. Allied reconnaissance spotted the convoy on March 1st and shadowed it throughout the day, reporting position, speed, and composition. Bad weather gave Japanese temporary protection, but by morning of March 2nd the skies had cleared. The battle began with B-17s attacking from 20,000 feet, exactly as Kimura expected. Few direct hits were scored, but the high-altitude attacks forced the convoy to scatter and expend ammunition against targets too high for effective engagement. This first wave achieved its purpose, disorganizing the defensive formation and distracting fighter cover. Japanese commanders felt vindicated. The Americans were following expected patterns. Ineffective, high-altitude bombing that could be endured with acceptable losses. Then, the morning of March 3rd brought something entirely new. At approximately 9:30, Major Ed Larner led 12 B-25 strafers toward the scattered ships. They were accompanied by A-20 gunships and protected by 16 P-38 Lightning fighters. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters had already made strafing runs, killing gun crews and destroying anti-aircraft positions. What happened next shattered every assumption about aerial combat against ships. Flying at altitudes between 50 and 200 feet, strafer B-25s approached at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. Lieutenant Charles Howe, flying Larner's wing, later described seeing Japanese ships grow terrifyingly large in his windscreen. Tracers from surviving anti-aircraft guns arced toward them, some passing within feet of his canopy. The distance closed with shocking speed, 300 yards, 200 yards. Then the order came through his headset, guns free, fire. 8 nose guns opened fire simultaneously, and the world dissolved into noise and fury. Combined firepower from 96 heavy machine guns across the formation created a storm no ship could withstand. Japanese sailors crowded on deck were torn apart instantly, bodies shredded by 50 caliber rounds traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Officers on bridges died at their stations, glass and metal and flesh becoming indistinguishable in the maelstrom. Gun crews attempting to track low-flying bombers were cut down before they could fire a single shot. Ammunition handlers collapsed beside their weapons. The deck erupted as rounds detonated ammunition stores and punctured fuel lines. One co-pilot, watching from his right seat window, later wrote in his diary that men looked like sticks in a whirlwind, spinning crazily before splashing into the sea. The killing was industrial in its efficiency, mechanical in its execution. A bomber approaching at 250 miles per hour covered approximately 360 feet per second. From first sighting at 3,000 feet to bomb release at 300 feet took approximately 7 seconds of actual gun time. 7 seconds during which 200 pounds of lead per minute from each strafer obliterated everything human on the target ship's deck. Then came the bombs. Each B-25 carried 4 500-pound bombs with delayed action fuses set for 4 to 5 seconds. Released at point-blank range between 200 and 300 feet, the bombs behaved exactly as designed. They skipped across the water surface like stones thrown by a giant hand, maintaining forward velocity from the aircraft's speed. The first bounce carried them perhaps 200 feet. The second bounce, slightly lower and shorter, then impact against the ship's hull at or just below the waterline. The physics of skip bombing were brutally simple. A bomb released from high altitude fell vertically. Its energy dissipated over thousands of feet of atmosphere. Impact velocity against a ship's deck was relatively low, but a bomb skipped at wavetop height retained the aircraft's forward momentum. When 500 pounds of explosive travelling at over 200 miles per hour struck a steel hull, the kinetic energy alone was devastating. Then came the detonation. Delayed action fuses allowed bombs to penetrate the hull and sink several feet below the surface before exploding. Water, being incompressible, magnified the blast pressure by factors of 10 or more compared to air detonations. Explosions that would have damaged a deck now tore 20-foot holes in the hull below the waterline. Seawater poured in with the force of high-pressure fire hoses. Engine rooms flooded within minutes. Ships that had survived decades of service were reduced to sinking wrecks almost instantly. Shinai Maru took 3 skip bombs amidships within 30 seconds. Commander Sugawara, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, watched his ship die. The list increased rapidly as water poured through massive hull breaches. 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15. Orders to abandon ship were barely heard over the roar of escaping steam and the screams of men trapped in flooding compartments. The ship rolled onto her port side within 8 minutes of the first bomb impact. Hundreds of soldiers who had survived the strafing drowned in darkness below decks, trapped by jammed hatches and flooded passageways. The second wave that afternoon finished the destruction. By evening on March 3rd, every Japanese transport had been sunk or was sinking. 4 destroyers were at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The convoy that departed Rabaul with 7,000 troops had been utterly annihilated. Japanese casualties exceeded 2,800 killed, most drowned when transports sank or were killed by strafing after abandoning ship. American losses were minimal by comparison. 13 aircrew killed, 12 wounded, 4 aircraft shot down in combat, 2 crash-landed from battle damage. The disparity was so extreme it seemed impossible. An entire convoy destroyed for the loss of 4 bombers. Traditional naval engagement would have required battleships, cruisers, destroyers, perhaps carriers, thousands of sailors at risk, ships costing tens of millions of dollars exposed to enemy fire. Instead, modified bombers costing a fraction of a warship's price had achieved total victory in hours. The strategic implications were profound and immediate. General Douglas MacArthur, observing from a B-17 circling at safe altitude, reportedly jumped with excitement when the victory's scale became apparent. His message to Kenny conveyed barely suppressed euphoria. Gratitude and felicitations on the magnificent victory that cannot fail to go down in history as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. Kenny's response to General Whitehead was equally triumphant. Air power has written important history. Tell the whole gang I'm so proud I'm about to blow a fuse. But for Japanese commanders, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea represented catastrophe on multiple levels. The immediate tactical loss was severe. 7,000 troops who would never reach their destination, 8 transports and 4 destroyers on the ocean floor. Entire battalions erased before firing a shot in defense of Leh. The psychological impact cut even deeper. Japanese naval doctrine had assumed convoys faced acceptable risk from air attack. High-altitude bombing was ineffective. Surface vessels could defend themselves adequately. The Bismarck Sea shattered these assumptions completely. Admiral Kimura survived the battle aboard destroyer Shikinami, one of 4 escorts that escaped. His after-action report made grim reading for naval headquarters in Tokyo. American bombers had attacked at altitudes making evasion impossible. The 40-second window from first sighting to bomb impact was insufficient for effective defensive fire. Ships' anti-aircraft guns had been silenced by strafing before they could engage properly. Skip bombing delivered ordnance with accuracy approaching 100%. Every bomb that skipped successfully struck its target. The mathematics of aerial combat had been completely rewritten. Japanese commanders realized with cold horror that any surface convoy attempting to cross waters within range of American air bases would face annihilation. The era of large-scale amphibious reinforcement was over in 5th Air Force-controlled waters. From March 1943 onward, Japan relied primarily on submarines and small barges for Southwest Pacific resupply, moving at night to avoid air detection. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently to the Americans. News of the battle spread rapidly through Allied commands. Skeptical commanders who had questioned low-level bombing tactics now demanded their own strafer conversions. The 345th Bombardment Group, arriving in August 1943, found all 60 B-25s converted to strafer configuration by air depot groups working around the clock. Modification centers at Eagle Farm and Mount Louisa operated 12 to 18-hour shifts, transforming standard B-25s into the world's most heavily armed bombers. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical evolution of skip bombing continued throughout 1943 and 1944. Initial conversions had been improvised field modifications using salvaged machine guns and hand-fabricated mounting plates. By late 1943, North American Aviation sent engineering teams to Australia to study guns modifications. Factory-produced B-25G models mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose, along with two 50-caliber machine guns, creating tank killers that could destroy hardened bunkers and coastal fortifications from standoff range. The B-25H increased forward-firing armament to 14 50-caliber guns, including relocated dorsal turret and side-mounted cheek guns. The final B-25J model with strafer nose could bring 18 50-caliber guns to bear simultaneously, throwing over 400 pounds of lead per minute. This represented the ultimate expression of gun's original concept. A medium bomber transformed into a flying arsenal capable of obliterating anything that moved on land or sea. Training for skip bombing represented another challenge requiring months to master. The technique demanded precise coordination of altitude, speed, and bomb release point. Too high and bombs would dive rather than skip. Too low and bombs might bounce over targets or strike the bomber itself. Too fast and pilots would overshoot release points. Too slow and bombers would become stationary targets for defensive fire. Pilots practiced endlessly against wrecked ships and floating targets until they could judge release points instinctively even under fire. The SS Pruth, a merchant ship aground on Natira Reef near Port Moresby since 1924, became the primary training target. For months, pilots practiced attacks against this stationary hulk until they could hit consistently with multiple bombs. Training was dangerous. Several aircraft were damaged by flying debris from bomb blasts. One crashed after colliding with the wreck's mast during a low-level pass. But hard practice paid dividends when crews faced real targets under combat conditions. The 40-second window became central to skip bombing doctrine. From first sighting to bomb impact, defenders had approximately 40 seconds to respond. During those 40 seconds, everything had to happen simultaneously. Gun crews had to identify the threat, train weapons, begin firing, and maintain tracking despite incoming strafing fire. Ship captains had to recognize the attack pattern, issue evasive orders, and hope the ship could turn fast enough to present a smaller target profile. For the attackers, 40 seconds meant closing from 3,000 feet to bomb release at 300 feet, while suppressing all defensive fire. Japanese survivors consistently described those 40 seconds as the most terrifying experience of the war. Petty Officer Takeshi Yamada, pulled from the water after his transport sank, later recalled the sensation of helplessness. We saw them coming very low, like angry wasps. The sound of their engines grew impossibly loud. Then the noise of guns, so many guns firing at once that individual shots merged into continuous thunder. Men around me were falling, torn apart before they could reach their battle stations. I tried to run below deck, but the hatch was blocked by bodies, The bomb struck perhaps 10 seconds later. I was thrown into the air and landed in burning oil on the water's surface. The psychological dimension extended beyond individual terror. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit and determination as decisive factors in combat. Proper attitude could overcome material disadvantage. Courage could defeat superior numbers. The Bismarck Sea demonstrated the limits of this philosophy with brutal clarity. No amount of courage protected men from 50-caliber rounds traveling faster than sound. No amount of determination could keep ships afloat with 20-foot holes below the waterline. Spirit could not change mathematics. This realization spread through Japanese forces in the Southwest Pacific like psychological poison. Soldiers and sailors who survived strafer attacks carried trauma that affected their combat effectiveness for the war's duration. The sound of approaching American bombers at low altitude triggered panic responses in troops who had witnessed the carnage such attacks produced. Unit cohesion deteriorated as veterans refused to expose themselves to open deck positions during air attacks, preferring to hide below deck despite orders. Morale collapsed among garrison forces, knowing they could be annihilated from the air with no effective defense. American tactical doctrine evolved to exploit this psychological advantage. Coordinated attacks became standard procedure. B-17s would bomb from medium altitude to scatter formations and draw fighter cover high. Beaufighters or P-38s would strafe at wavetop height, killing gun crews and destroying anti-aircraft weapons. Finally, B-25 strafers would make skip bombing runs with maximum firepower, releasing ordnance at point-blank range where missing was nearly impossible. Every element had been rehearsed until it became second nature. The result was tactical sophistication Japanese forces had no counter for. The human cost of these attacks raised ethical questions that persist to this day. Kenney ordered aircraft to strafe survivors in the water after the Bismarck Sea battle, reasoning that enemy soldiers allowed to reach shore would rejoin combat forces. Pilots described machine-gunning lifeboats, rafts, and swimmers with clinical detachment. One pilot's log entry read simply, "Expended ammunition on survivors in water, estimate 50 to 75 killed." The justification was brutally pragmatic. War is not a sporting contest with rules about when fighting stops. Every enemy soldier killed in the water was one fewer American soldiers would face on land. Major Ed Lana defended the practice in post-war interviews without apology. "We strafed survivors because those same men would have killed American soldiers if they reached Leh. War is not a football game with timeouts and second chances. I don't apologize for decisions made in combat by men fighting for their lives and their country." The ethical debate continued for decades. Critics argued that firing on defenseless survivors violated laws of war and basic humanity. Defenders countered that total war against an enemy who showed no mercy to prisoners required maximum application of force to achieve victory with minimum Allied casualties. The transformation of the B-25 from conventional bomber to devastating strafer represented one of history's most successful aircraft modification programs. More than 5,000 B-25s were built during the war, with hundreds converted to strafer configuration either in field modification centers or at the factory. These aircraft served from the Southwest Pacific to the Mediterranean, wherever American forces needed close air support or anti-shipping capability. The B-25 became World War II's most heavily armed bomber, capable of missions no other aircraft could accomplish. Paul Gunn continued flying combat missions despite being decades older than most combat pilots. He survived, being shot down, crash landing behind enemy lines, and numerous near-death experiences. His personal vendetta against Japan, fueled by his family's imprisonment in Manila, drove him to take risks that shocked even aggressive young pilots. When Manila was liberated in February 1945, Gunn was reunited with his wife and children after 3 years of separation. He had kept his promise to make the Japanese pay for every day of their captivity. The legacy of skip bombing and strafer tactics extended far beyond World War II. The fundamental principle that Gunn pioneered, overwhelming enemy defenses with concentrated firepower before delivering ordnance at close range, became central to close air support doctrine. Modern attack helicopters, like the AH-64 Apache, employ the same philosophy. Suppress defensive fire with cannons and machine guns, then destroy targets with precision-guided missiles at ranges where defenders cannot effectively respond. The technology changed dramatically, but the tactical concept remained identical. The 40-second window that defined skip bombing operations became a case study in the importance of reaction time in combat. Modern military analysis recognizes that decision-making under extreme time pressure determines outcomes. 40 seconds is long enough to make choices, but too short for careful deliberation. Training must create instinctive responses that function under stress. Japanese defenders at the Bismarck Sea failed because 40 seconds proved insufficient to overcome surprise, coordinate defensive fire, and implement evasive maneuvers simultaneously. American attackers succeeded because months of training had made their attack sequence automatic. By war's end in August 1945, Strafer B-25s had flown thousands of combat missions across the Pacific. They had destroyed over 1,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground, sunk or damaged hundreds of ships, and killed tens of thousands of enemy troops. Allied losses among Strafer crews were substantially lower than among conventional bomber crews, attacking similar targets from medium altitude. Every statistical measure confirmed the Strafer concept had been spectacularly successful in achieving its design objectives. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea remained the most famous demonstration of Strafer effectiveness, but dozens of similar engagements throughout 1943 and 1944 achieved comparable results with less publicity. Japanese convoys attempting to reach New Guinea, the Philippines, or the Dutch East Indies were systematically destroyed by Allied air attacks. The cumulative effect starved Japanese garrisons of reinforcements, ammunition, fuel, and food. Isolated units couldn't be resupplied or evacuated. Maritime isolation of Japanese forces contributed directly to Allied victories in ground campaigns across the Pacific. The transformation of American air power in the Pacific from 1941 to 1942, disasters to 1944 to 1945, overwhelming dominance represented one of military history's most remarkable turnarounds. Industrial capacity and numerical superiority played crucial roles, but tactics and innovation were equally important. The willingness to modify aircraft in field workshops based on combat experience, to discard doctrines that failed to produce results, and to trust unconventional officers like Pappy Gunn made the difference between stalemate and victory. Today, the lessons of skip bombing remain relevant to military planners studying ways to neutralize enemy assets before they can be employed effectively. The 40-second window that Japanese commanders faced in the Bismarck Sea represents the modern concept of the ODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. In combat, whoever completes this cycle faster gains decisive advantage. American Strafer crews completed their ODA loop in seconds through training and preparation. Japanese defenders needed minutes they didn't have. The outcome was predetermined before the first bomb was released. Paul Gunn survived the war, but his health had been damaged by years of combat stress, injuries, and tropical diseases that plagued everyone who served in the Southwest Pacific. He returned to the Philippines and rebuilt his airline company. He died when his aircraft crashed in a storm over the Philippines on October 11, 1957, at age 57. No major biographies were written during his lifetime. No monuments were erected in his honor. Only gradually did historians recognize that Gunn's innovations had been as important to Pacific victory as better-known developments like radar or the atomic bomb. The weapons systems he created were attributed to institutional developments rather than individual genius. But combat crews who flew his modified aircraft knew the truth. One pilot's letter home in 1944 captured it perfectly. "We owe our lives to an old chief who refused to believe the experts when they said something couldn't be done. He built us flying fortresses with wings, and we use them to kill the enemy before they can kill us. That's all that matters in this war." The 40 seconds that Japanese commanders faced before skip bombs struck their ships at 300 miles per hour represented more than a tactical innovation. It symbolized the transformation of warfare from tradition-bound doctrines to pragmatic adaptation. The side that learned faster, modified equipment more quickly, and trained crews more effectively gained advantages that statistics alone could not predict. Industrial production provided the tools. Innovation and training determined how effectively those tools were employed. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.